too soft on the Israelis. Anybody who follows this carefully knows that he basically got the story right. And again, to the extent he was wrong, he should have been tougher on the Israelis. But you saw what happened to Judge Goldstone. This is how powerful the lobby is. Alan Dershowitz was correct, right, when he said that Jews of my generation created what is perhaps the most powerful interest group in the history of democracy. Remarkably powerful interest group. So I think you don't want to put too much emphasis on opacity. It matters on the margins, or it mattered once on the margins, but not very much. This brings me to the final subject. Is it in Israel's interest for Israel to have nuclear weapons? Now, very important to understand that Israel's supporters in the United States go to enormous lengths to make the argument that there's no difference between Israel's interests and America's interests. Because once you open the possibility that the two countries have different interests, then they're forced to choose in a very public fashion. And of course, they'll invariably choose Israel's interests over America's interests. And that is not something that they want to have happen in public. Right? And this is why they've gone to great lengths to create this situation where it looks like Obama and Netanyahu have patched up all their differences, and to the extent that there are differences, they'll be handled behind closed doors. Because they don't want those differences out in the open. But of course, as we all know, no two countries have the same interest. There's nothing to do with Israel or the United States. It's just the way international politics works. There are going to be cases where it's in Israel's interest to do certain things and not in America's interest to allow Israel to do those things. And there is no issue, I believe, where that is clearer than the nuclear issue. As I made clear in my opening set of remarks, I do believe it was in Israel's interest to develop nuclear weapons. By the way, I think it's in Iran's interest today to develop nuclear weapons. If I was President Ahmadinejad's national security advisor and he asked me what to do, I would tell him to acquire a nuclear deterrent. Is that in America's interest? Absolutely not. Iran and the United States have different interests. No two states have the same interests. I believe it was in Israel's interest to acquire nuclear weapons, and I'm hardly surprised at all the activities that the Israelis engaged in that Grant so eloquently described. That's the way states behave in the international system, and they go to great lengths to disguise their behavior. Okay? But it was not then in America's interest for Israel to acquire nuclear weapons, and it is not in our interest now for Israel to have nuclear weapons. This is why, as Grant described, President Kennedy went to great lengths to prevent Israel from acquiring nuclear weapons and to get them to join the NPT. And President Johnson, very, very interesting figure on this whole subject of U.S.-Israeli relations. President Johnson may have been willing to give Israel a green light or an orange light, however you want to characterize it. But you can see from Grant's comments and from reading the literature on this that down below all sorts of people were protesting, and all sorts of people in the national security establishment wanted to go to great lengths to stop Israel from acquiring nuclear weapons. Because again, it wasn't in our interest. And the two best examples that show how it's not in our interest is what happened during the 1973 war. And during that conflict, you all remember the Israelis looked like they were in dire straits in the first few days. And they wanted the United States to immediately resupply them. The Nixon administration said no, because the Nixon administration judged quite correctly that once the Israelis recovered from the initial surprise, they would do very well. And therefore the U.S. government did not want to give the Israelis at that point more arms. The Israelis then threatened to pull the nuclear weapons out and began talking about using nuclear weapons. That, not surprisingly, spooked the Americans, who immediately began resupplying the Israelis, even though they did not want to do that. That's a form of nuclear coercion. From Israel's point of view, it was a smart policy. From our point of view, it was not good. And then the second example is what's recently been going on with regard to nuclear proliferation. It's quite clear, and you see this from the recent review conference, that the fact that Israel has nuclear weapons, and again, we're not fooling anybody with this opaque rhetoric, the fact that Israel has nuclear weapons is making it very difficult for the United States to stem the tide on proliferation and to move to a nuclear-free Middle East. So again, it's just not in our interest, and it would have been much better if we could, from our point of view, if we could have prevented Israel from acquiring nuclear weapons. Let me just conclude with a few words on where this situation is headed. I actually believe that the situation is going to get much worse over time. I believe that we are not going to have an Israeli-Palestinian peace settlement. I believe that talk of a two-state solution and all this talk about moving from proximity talks to direct talks is a charade. I find it hard to believe that people in this town take this discussion seriously at this point in time. You're going to get a greater Israel, and it either is or is going to be an apartheid state. It is going to cause us enormous problems in the Middle East or in the Arab and Islamic world, and it's going to continue to keep relations between Israel and its neighbors in a troublesome state. On the proliferation front, I would not be surprised if Iran and other countries continue to move down the nuclear road. You already see the Jordanians expressing interest in developing a significant nuclear enrichment capability. It'd be interesting to see what Turkey does. As I said to you before, I believe that Iraq will want nuclear weapons if Iran has nuclear weapons. They'd be foolish not to, from an Iraqi point of view. A Middle East where more than one state has nuclear weapons makes me very, very nervous. And of course, what this is all going to point to is the fact that America's interests and Israel's interests are going to continue to diverge. And the end result of that back here in the United States is that the lobby is going to have to work overtime to cover that up and make it look like everything is hunky-dory, when in fact it's not. And that has all sorts of negative consequences for domestic politics. So I think things are very bad now, but I'm sad to say they're only going to get worse.